Somewhere in a book bindery window on a narrow street in Halifax, in the slow gray light of the 1860s, a dark, heavy rock sat on display behind the glass. Passers-by slowed to look at it. Sailors paused on their way to the waterfront. Clerks on their lunch break pressed closer to read the small printed card that accompanied it. The card promised that this unremarkable piece of stone, roughly the length of a man's forearm, carried a message worth a fortune. Somewhere on its surface, it was said, ran a line of carved characters that pointed the way to buried treasure. 2 million pounds of it, waiting beneath an island not far from the city. For a small subscription, any interested gentleman could purchase a share in the company that would bring it up. The stone in the window was real. That much is certain. It existed. It was handled. It was moved. It was sold in the imagination of a province and written about in newspapers whose brittle pages still survive in the archives. Named men wrote letters about it. A professor from the local university was said to have translated it. A novelist who worked down the hall from that professor described something suspiciously similar in a book of fiction. Hundreds of people, by the most conservative estimate, laid eyes on it over the course of half a century. Some of those people lived long enough to give sworn recollections of what they had seen. Others left brief accounts and correspondence that historians have been sifting through ever since. And yet, for all that attention, for all those witnesses, for all those decades of public presence, not one of them left behind a photograph of the stone. Not one of them made a rubbing of its surface. Not one of them drew a sketch of the carved characters that were supposed to be its entire reason for mattering. No newspaper reproduced the inscription. No academic journal cataloged it. No museum requested a plaster cast. The book bindery that displayed it kept no detailed inventory. The university whose professor translated it preserved no notes of the translation. The investors who bought shares on the strength of its message kept no contemporary copy of what that message was. The stone itself eventually disappeared. Not dramatically, not in some unsolved theft or catastrophic fire. It simply slipped out of the record in the way that inconvenient objects tend to sometime in the years after the First World War, when the book bindery closed its doors and its contents were dispersed. And no one recorded where it went. No one seemed by that point to care very much. A stone that had once been displayed as proof of buried millions ended its visible life as an afterthought among the unswept corners of a failing business, and then it was gone. What remains is a problem of a particular and unsettling kind. If the stone was genuine, if it bore the cipher that so many claim to have seen, then its disappearance represents one of the strangest failures of documentation in the history of the region. If it was not genuine, if the inscription was exaggerated or invented or applied to a stone that had never carried anything of the sort, then its century-long career as a public object represents something stranger still. A piece of theater sustained across generations. He's kept alive by people who had every reason to know better and chose not to. Either reading is uncomfortable. Both readings cannot be true at once. And the evidence, as we will see, refuses to settle cleanly on either. Before going any further, a small invitation. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour has found you, let the mind settle into the slowness of this story. It is not a story about treasure, though treasure will run through it like a thread. It is a story about an object that was supposed to prove something and somehow, across 2 centuries, managed to prove nothing except the persistence of the people who needed it to exist. To understand how a stone can be seen by hundreds and survive in no image, how it can be translated by a professor and leave no manuscript, and how it can sit in a shop window for months and never be photographed, We have to return to the place where it first came out of the ground, a wooded island in a quiet bay on the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia. A hole in the earth that had already begun by the time the stone emerged to develop a reputation for swallowing men and their fortunes, and a small company of diggers who, at something like 90 feet below the surface, struck what they would later describe as a flat inscribed slab. Oak Island in the late 1790s was not a place that drew attention. It was one of some 300 small wooded islands scattered through Mahone Bay on the southern shore of Nova Scotia, indistinguishable at a glance from its neighbors, a low hump of spruce and oak rising gently from the cold Atlantic water. Its soil was thin, and its coves were shallow. The mainland fishing villages that faced it across the bay had no particular reason to think about it, and for most of recorded memory, they had not. The island carried no settlement, no farm of any consequence, no story worth telling around an evening fire. It was simply there, quiet and unremarkable, a piece of the coastline that the world had so far declined to notice. In the summer of 1795, a young man named Daniel McGinnis came ashore on the island, by most accounts alone, for reasons that later tellings have softened into legend. Whatever had brought him to that particular stretch of ground, he found something he had not expected. In a small clearing among the oaks, the earth had sunk. A circular depression, shallow but distinct, pressed down into the soil as though something beneath it had given way. Above the depression, by the account that would later enter the record, an old ship's block or tackle hung from the branch of a tree, weathered and decayed. McGinnis was young enough to be curious and cautious enough to come back with help. He returned with two companions, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, both close to his own age and both willing to spend their summer days digging into a hole whose origins no one could explain. What they found as they worked downward through the soft earth was not what they had imagined. A few feet below the surface, they struck a platform of oak logs, laid close together and clearly placed by human hands. They pulled the logs aside and kept digging. Roughly 10 feet below that, another platform. At 20 feet below that one, another. Someone, at some point in the island's undocumented past, had gone to considerable trouble to cover something, and to cover it in a way that suggested patience, skill, and an intention to defeat casual investigation. The three young men eventually abandoned the dig, unable to go deeper without funds and equipment. But they had seen enough to know that the hole was not natural, and the story of what they had seen began its slow travel across the province. It would be nearly a decade before the next attempt. Around 1804, a syndicate of investors operating out of the town of Truro, the company known in most accounts as the Onslow Company, took up the excavation with proper tools, hired labor, and the financial will to go further than three young men with shovels ever could. They reached depths that shocked them, and the oak platforms continued at regular intervals. Between them, at various levels, the diggers encountered layers of charcoal, layers of coconut fiber, layers of a substance variously described as ship's putty or a kind of sealing clay. None of these materials belonged in the natural soil of a Nova Scotian island. Coconut fiber, in particular, was an impossibility, its source lying thousands of miles south, in tropical waters that no local tree could account for. Each strange layer deepened the impression that whatever was buried in this pit had been buried by people who understood preservation, concealment, and the long patience of water tables. And then, somewhere between 80 and 90 feet below the surface, the Onslow diggers struck a stone. It was flat. It was not large, as stones go. It's perhaps the length and weight of a heavy hearthstone, and it was lying in a position that suggested deliberate placement, rather than geological accident. Its upper face, when cleaned, bore markings. The earliest accounts describe them only as characters or as letters or as figures, without ever quite committing to what they were. No one on the dig could read them. No one recognized them as belonging to any alphabet familiar in the region. The stone was lifted out, passed from hand to hand, examined in the dim lamplight of the pit shaft, and eventually brought to the surface. Whatever it said, if it said anything at all, it said it in a language that the Onslow men could not recognize. The stone became almost immediately a curiosity rather than a clue. The diggers pressed further down into the pit and soon encountered the problem that would define the site for the next 2 centuries. The shaft began to flood. Water rose into the workings faster than they could bail it out, and the lower levels, where the treasure was presumed to lie, were lost to the tide. The Onslow Company eventually gave up, their capital exhausted, but the stone survived the collapse of their enterprise because John Smith, one of the original 3 discoverers, had by then purchased the land that contained the pit and had taken the stone home with him as something between a keepsake and a curiosity. Around 1824, Smith built a new house on his property, and he built the stone into the chimney of that house. He placed it, by the accounts that survive, with its inscribed face turned outward, so that anyone warming themselves at his fire could look up and see the markings that had come out of the pit. For the next 40 years, the stone remained there, lodged in the masonry of a rural Nova Scotian farmhouse, visible to visitors, handled by family members, and slowly, quietly becoming a piece of local lore. A cipher no one could read, built into a wall in a province that had largely forgotten what lay buried on the island where it had been found. The stone sat in the chimney for a generation before anyone thought to write down what was carved on it. That single fact, small as it seems, is the quiet foundation on which every later uncertainty rests. The inscription was supposedly the whole reason the stone mattered. It was the reason John Smith had taken it home, the reason he had set it into the masonry with its marked face turned outward. The reason visitors to the house were invited to look at it at all. And yet, for roughly 6 decades, no one who saw it appears to have sat down with a sheet of paper and copied what they saw. No one produced a drawing. No one pressed a damp cloth against the surface to take an impression of the marks. The stone was there, visible, reachable, and for 60 years the people who looked at it simply looked and moved on. The first description that survives in anything approaching detail comes from a man named George Cook, who saw the stone in the chimney around the middle of the century, perhaps as early as 1849 and certainly no later than 1850. Cook described what he had seen in a letter written years afterward, and his account is the closest thing we have to a first-hand window onto the inscription in its domestic setting. He described the markings as rudely cut. He used the phrase letters, figures, or characters, leaving the question of what he had actually been looking at suspended among 3 possibilities. He added, almost as an aside, that the marks appeared to have been scraped out by a blunt instrument, not carved with care, not inscribed with the precision of a mason or a scribe, scraped as though whoever made them had worked with whatever tool happened to be at hand and had not been especially concerned with neatness. The second surviving description came from J.B. McCulley, a figure associated with one of the later treasure syndicates, who wrote about the stone in the Liverpool transcript in 1862. Macaulay's account is brief and somewhat vague, referring to the stone and the characters upon it without venturing to describe them in any specific way. By 1864, when the secretary of the local historical society corresponded with Cook to confirm what he remembered, a further detail had entered the picture. The stone by then was no longer clearly visible. In the chimney, a wooden staircase had been built across the wall where it sat, and the inscribed face, which had once looked out into the room, was now partly obscured behind the boards. The object that everyone agreed was a matter of historical importance had, by the time anyone was paying serious historical attention, already begun the slow process of disappearing behind the furniture of ordinary domestic life. What is striking about these early accounts is not what they contain, but what they conspicuously do not. None of the surviving witnesses from this period produced a copy of the inscription. None of them described the individual characters in a way that would allow a later reader to reconstruct them. None of them compared the marks to any known alphabet, ancient or modern, or suggested what language they might belong to. Cook's letter, the most detailed account we have from the chimney period, is essentially a description of the stone's general appearance and the impression the marks made on him as a viewer. Whether there were 3 characters or 30, whether they were arranged in a line or scattered across the surface, whether they resembled Roman letters or Arabic numerals or something stranger, the early record does not say. There is also the matter of the stone itself, the physical object on which these elusive marks were carved. And the accounts from this period do not agree on what it was made of. Some descriptions suggest a soft stone, something like a sandstone or a fine-grained greyhock, the kind of material on which a blunt instrument could indeed leave scraped impressions without much difficulty. Other accounts, appearing later but drawing on memories from the chimney era, describe a harder stone, darker in color, heavier in weight, closer in character to a volcanic basalt or a dense granite. A soft stone and a hard stone are not the same object. They cannot be made to match by any effort of reconciliation. Either the witnesses were looking at different things, or they were looking at the same thing and remembering it differently, or the stone itself, over the decades of its chimney residency, had somehow been confused in memory with another object entirely. What emerges from these early descriptions when laid side by side is not a stone. It is the suggestion of a stone, a verbal sketch produced by men who had each glimpsed a real object at a real moment and had then carried their partial impressions into a record that could no longer be corrected. No 2 accounts contradict each other outright, but no 2 accounts confirm each other in any detail that could be independently tested. The stone was there, the marks were there. Beyond that, the record dissolves into a haze of approximation. This is not how evidence is supposed to behave when it matters. A genuine inscribed artifact examined across 6 decades by literate observers in a settled colonial society, you always ought to leave behind at minimum 1 careful drawing, 1 measured description, 1 considered attempt at translation or comparison. The Oak Island stone, in its chimney years, left none of these. What it left was the impression of an inscription, preserved in the memories of men who had not thought to copy it down, passed through correspondence that grew vaguer with each retelling, and waiting, by the early 1860s, for the moment when someone would finally decide that the stone was worth more outside the chimney than within it. By the middle of the 1860s, Oak Island had entered a new phase of its long, slow, financially ruinous career. The early syndicates had come and gone, each one draining its investors and withdrawing in defeat when the pit filled with water faster than it could be pumped dry. A new generation of men, no less optimistic and no less in need of capital, had taken up the excavation. They called themselves the Oak Island Association, and they faced the same problem every syndicate before them had faced. The treasure, if there was a treasure, lay somewhere below the water line, and reaching it required money. Money required investors. Investors, in turn, required something to look at something to hold in the imagination, something tangible that could be pointed to as evidence that the enterprise was more than a hole in the ground, swallowing subscriptions. In 1865, or perhaps the following year, a man named Jefferson McDonald was dispatched to the Smith farmhouse with instructions to remove the stone from the chimney. The house by this time had passed out of the hands of its original builder. The stone had been sitting in its wall for more than 40 years, partly obscured behind the staircase that had been added in the intervening decades, exposed to 4 decades of wood smoke, winter frost, and the ordinary abuse of domestic masonry. MacDonald and his helpers worked the stone free, carried it out of the house, and began its journey off the island and toward the city. It traveled first to Truro, the small inland town that had been a headquarters for several of the earlier syndicates, and from Truro it was taken onward to Halifax, where it came to rest in the premises of a firm of bookbinders named A. and H. Creighton. The Creighton brothers operated out of a building near the Halifax waterfront in a district of printers, stationers, and commercial agents. Their trade was the binding of books, of a skilled craft that involved the sewing, pressing, and leather dressing of printed pages into finished volumes. They had no obvious connection to archaeology, geology, or the serious study of historical artifacts. What they had, and what made their premises useful, was a shop window that faced a busy street. The stone was placed in that window. A card was placed alongside it. The card invited interested parties to consider investing in the latest company formed to extract the treasure of Oak Island. This detail, small as it is, deserves to be held up to the light. The stone had not been given to a museum. It had not been lodged with the Nova Scotia Historical Society, whose members had only recently been corresponding about its existence. It had not been placed in the collections of the provincial legislature or sent to a university for examination. It had been put in the window of a commercial bindery, alongside an invitation to buy shares. Whatever else the stone was, it had now unambiguously become an advertisement. Its physical presence in a public window served one purpose above all others, which was to generate the conviction that something real lay behind the subscription prospectus. Into this arrangement stepped Professor James Liechty of Dalhousie University. Liechty was a teacher of modern languages at the young college on the hill above the harbor, a man whose academic credentials lent a certain respectability to whatever he chose to pronounce upon. According to the accounts that survive, he examined the stone and produced a translation of its inscription. The translation, as it entered the public record, rendered the marks as a statement to the effect that 10 feet below, 2 million pounds lay buried. The exact wording varied slightly between tellings, but the substance was consistent. The stone said in so many words that there was money down the hole, and it named a sum large enough to concentrate the attention of any prospective investor. The translation should have settled the matter. A university professor, examining an inscribed artifact in a city where the academic community was small enough that reputations were fragile, had delivered a verdict on what the marks meant. In practice, it settled nothing. Even at the time, voices were raised in quiet skepticism. Translation had emerged in the immediate context of a share-selling campaign. Should the professor who produced it worked in a university whose operations were partly dependent on the goodwill of the same commercial class that was being asked to buy shares. And there was the awkward coincidence that one of Liechty's colleagues at Dalhousie, the novelist James DeMille, was at roughly this moment engaged in writing a work of fiction that featured an inscribed stone of mysterious origin, discovered in a remote location, bearing a message that required specialized interpretation. Whether DeMille drew on the Oak Island stone for inspiration, or whether the stone drew on DeMille's imagination for its sudden literary availability, the two productions existed side by side in the same small academic world, reinforcing each other in ways that no one at the time seems to have thought worth examining carefully. The translation, and in any case, did its commercial work. The Oak Island Association used it. Later, syndicates used it. A prospectus issued in 1893, nearly 3 decades after the stone had first appeared in the Halifax window, still quoted the Liechti rendering as if it were established fact. Investors, presented with the professor's authority and the newspaper coverage that accompanied it, opened their purses. The stone in the window did what it had been placed there to do. And then, at some point during its years on Creighton's premises, the stone was taken out of the window. It was moved inside onto the working floor of the bindery, where it assumed a new and considerably more mundane role. Bookbinders at this period used heavy, flat stones as surfaces against which to beat leather, softening and smoothing the hides that would become book covers. The Oak Island stone, whatever its former dignity as the supposed key to buried millions, was flat and heavy and available. It became a working tool. Hour after hour, day after day, the leather of Halifax's bound books was pressed and pounded against the same surface that was supposed to carry the inscription that pointed the way to treasure. Whether anyone at the bindery thought much about the irony is not recorded. The stone had been promoted to the status of public curiosity and demoted to the status of workshop fixture within the span of a few years, and the transition seems to have been accepted without comment, as though both roles had always been equally plausible, and as though the marks on its surface, whatever they had been, were of less consequence than the work that remained to be done. Expanding section 5, now at exactly 1,400 words. In the autumn of 1911, a man named Captain Henry L. Bowden arrived in Halifax with the intention of examining, among other things, the Oak Island stone. Bowden was an American engineer, a treasure hunter by inclination, and the leader of an expedition that had recently attempted and failed to reach the bottom of the money pit. He was writing an account of his experiences for Collier's magazine, and his article would eventually appear in print in the summer of 1911 under a title that captured, with some bitterness, his disillusionment with the entire enterprise. Before writing his conclusions, he wanted to look at the stone for himself. He went to Creighton's, where the stone was known to reside, and he asked to see it. What he saw and what he reported in Collier's landed in the historical record with a weight that has never quite been absorbed by the popular legend. Bowden described the stone he examined as a piece of hard, dense rock, comparable in character to a basalt or a similar volcanic material. It was heavy, it was dark, it showed signs of long use, and by his account, it bore no inscription. There were scratches on its surface, which he attributed to the ordinary wear of a stone that had spent years being struck by the tools and materials of a working bindery. There were no characters, there were no letters, there were no figures arranged in any pattern that suggested deliberate carving. Whatever had once been on the stone, if anything had ever been on it, it was not there for Bowden to see in the autumn of 1911. This was not the report of a casual observer. Bowden was a man who had traveled from New York to Nova Scotia specifically to investigate the Oak Island claim, who had invested his own reputation in the expedition and who had every incentive, if the inscription had been visible, to describe it in detail. He was also writing for a mass circulation American magazine, and a dramatic account of a genuine cipher would have served his article better than a flat denial. His conclusion, reached against the grain of what the reading public wanted to hear, was that the inscribed stone did not live up to its reputation. The marks that had built a legend were not, in his direct experience, on the object he had been shown. A quarter of a century later, in the mid-1930s, a further testimony entered the record. A man named Harry Marshall, whose father had been associated with the Crichton business in its later years, gave a recollection of the stone as he had known it. By the time Marshall was old enough to pay attention to it, the stone had been in the bindery for decades, used daily as a beating surface for the softening of leather. He described it carefully. It was roughly 2 feet in length, perhaps 15 inches wide, 10 inches thick. It weighed, by his estimate, around 175 pounds. It was dark in color, hard in texture, and reminiscent, he thought, of a kind of Swedish granite or a porphyry of similar character. On its surface, he recalled, the only visible markings were a pair of initials, J and M, which he understood to have been cut into it by someone associated with the bindery at some unknown date. Of the inscription that the stone was famous for carrying, Marshall saw nothing. He had grown up in the presence of this object, had watched it in use, had seen it in its ordinary working state, and he remembered no cipher. 2 witnesses, separated by 25 years, each examining the stone in the place where it had been publicly displayed, each reporting that the inscription that had sold shares and filled newspaper columns was not, in fact, there to be seen. This was not, strictly speaking, a contradiction of the earlier accounts. The earlier accounts had described markings that were crude, shallow, and scraped rather than carved. It was possible, even plausible, that such markings might have been gradually worn away by the very industrial use to which the stone was eventually put. A soft inscription on a hard stone, repeatedly struck against leather for 20 or 30 or 40 years, might reasonably have faded into invisibility. The absence Bowden and Marshall reported could, in principle, be reconciled with the presence Cook and Macaulay had earlier described. The stone could have been inscribed and then, through ordinary domestic and commercial use, de-inscribed. This would be a comfortable resolution if it were the end of the story. It is not. The true reversal, the detail that forces a complete rethinking of everything that has come before, arrives not in 1911 and not in the 1930s, but in 1949. More than 150 years after the stone was first lifted out of the pit. It arrives, moreover, in a form that the previous century and a half has provided no preparation for whatsoever. In that year, a writer named Edward Rowe Snow, an American author of popular histories of New England and maritime curiosities, was gathering material for a book on treasure legends. Among his correspondents was a Nova Scotian clergyman named the Reverend A. T. Kempton, a man with an interest in local lore and a willingness to share what he had collected. Kempton sent Snow a set of symbols accompanied by a translation. The symbols, he said, were the characters that had been carved on the Oak Island stone. The translation read, in its most familiar form, that 40 feet below, 2 million pounds were buried. Snow published the symbols and the translation in his book. From that moment forward, they entered the popular imagination as the cipher of the Oak Island stone. They appeared in subsequent books. They were reproduced in magazine articles. They became, in time, the image that anyone who had heard of the legend would call to mind when the stone was mentioned. The symbols were new. They had not appeared in Cook's letter. They had not appeared in Macaulay's newspaper report. They had not appeared in the correspondence of the Historical Society, or in the prospectuses of the various syndicates, or in any surviving account of the stone from the 19th century. They had not been described by Bowden in 1911, or by Marshall in the 1930s. They emerged into the documentary record, fully formed and immediately authoritative in the pages of a popular book published in the middle of the 20th century, supplied by a clergyman who cited as his source an unnamed school teacher who was, by the time anyone thought to ask, conveniently no longer alive. The translation, likewise, was new. The earlier Liechti rendering had placed the treasure 10 feet below. The Kempton version placed it 40 feet below. The sum, £2 million, had been retained, which was prudent, since £2 million was the sum that had always sold shares. But the depth had changed, the symbols had appeared, and the stone that had supposedly borne them had, by 1949, been missing for the better part of 3 decades. The implication is difficult and, once grasped, impossible to set aside. There's the single most famous piece of evidence in the entire Oak Island legend, the cipher that adorns book covers and thumbnails and the opening frames of documentaries, is younger than the automobile. It is younger than the airplane. It is younger than the sinking of the Titanic. The stone that hundreds of witnesses claim to have seen in a Nova Scotian farmhouse chimney and a Halifax shop window is not the stone whose symbols the modern world recognizes. They are, in any meaningful sense, different artifacts separated by more than a century of history and by the small decisive act of a man in 1949 who sat down and wrote a letter, expanding Section 6 now at exactly 1,200 words. With the 1949 reversal in hand, the earlier record begins to read differently. The contradictions that seemed absurd in their original context, like the ordinary imprecisions of 19th century memory, now arrange themselves into a pattern, and the pattern is not one of witnesses struggling to describe a difficult object. It is one of a legend being assembled over time, accreting detail in one generation and shedding it in the next, adjusting itself to the needs of whoever happened to be telling the story. Consider the question of material, which has run quietly beneath every account we have so far examined. Cook, remembering the stone in the chimney, described marks that had been scraped out by a blunt instrument, a description that implies a relatively soft stone, something on the order of a fine-grained sandstone or a gray rock, the kind of rock that yields to a metal edge without requiring the striking force of a true carving tool. Note this description, taken on its own, suggests an object whose surface could be worked casually, without great skill, and whose marks, once made, would be equally vulnerable to casual erasure. Bodin, examining the stone in 1911, described a hard, dense, basalt-like rock. Marshall, recalling the bindery in the 1930s, described a dark porphyry resembling Swedish granite. A soft sandstone and a hard porphyry are not the same material. They are not even close. No amount of weathering, no amount of leather beating, no plausible interpretation of ordinary wear can transform one into the other. The stone that Cook described and the stone that Bodwin and Marshall described cannot, by the ordinary laws of geology, be the same object. The question of inscription follows the same shape. Yet on the chimney era witnesses spoke of characters, letters, figures, marks, visible enough to be pointed out to visitors and memorable enough to be described decades later. The bindery era witnesses spoke of a stone whose surface bore only scratches and a pair of workman's initials. Between these two accounts lies roughly half a century. Half a century is long enough for many things, but it is not ordinarily long enough for a deliberately inscribed stone to become an entirely unmarked one, particularly when the only intervening use was the softening of leather against its surface. Leather beating is abrasive, but it is abrasive in a diffuse and relatively gentle way. It does not selectively remove carved characters while leaving the rest of the surface intact. The dimensions of the stone likewise refuse to settle. Various accounts, written at various times, give various sizes, and the sizes do not reliably converge. The weight estimates differ. The proportions differ. The color, in some descriptions, a dark gray verging on black, in others, a lighter shade altogether, differs. Each individual description, considered in isolation, is internally coherent. Taken together, they describe a family of stones rather than a single object. And then there is the silence. The stone throughout its public career was visible. It sat in a chimney for 40 years. It sat in a shop window for some portion of several years. After that, it sat on the floor of a working bindery for decades more. During all of this time, it was in the company of literate people in a province that had newspapers and a historical society and a university. No rubbing was ever made of it, and no photograph was ever taken of it, even after photography became available and relatively inexpensive. No careful drawing of the inscription has ever surfaced in any archive. The Crichton business, which used the stone daily for 30 or 40 years, kept no record of it in its surviving papers. The university, whose professor famously translated it, preserved no notes of the translation, no facsimile of the characters, no scholarly correspondence about the nature of the script. The silence is not the silence of an object no one cared about. It is the silence of an object that everyone claimed to care about, and no one, when the opportunity was at hand, actually examined in the way that objects of real historical importance are examined. From these patterns, a hypothesis has emerged among the careful modern investigators of the legend. It is the hypothesis that there was never, in truth, a single stone. There were instead several stones, each one serving a particular function at a particular moment in the legend's development. There may have been an original stone, the one lifted from the pit by the Onslow diggers, bearing whatever natural or crude markings had given rise to the earliest descriptions. There may have been a second stone, substituted or introduced during the Halifax display period, selected or modified for its suitability as a promotional object. And there may have been a third stone, or the second stone continued into a new role, which served as the bindery's working surface and which bore no inscription because no inscription had ever been on it. The three stones in this reading were never the same object. They were a succession of objects, each one stepping into the role the legend required, and each one sliding out of it when the next was needed. The hypothesis is admittedly speculative. It cannot be proved directly because the stones themselves are gone, and what is gone cannot be measured. But it explains, in a way that simpler theories do not, why the material descriptions fail to match, why the inscription appears in some accounts and not in others, why no rubbing or photograph was ever made, and why the object that entered the popular imagination in 1949 bore symbols that no 19th century witness had ever recorded. It explains the behavior of the evidence by positing that the evidence was never, at any point, examining a single stable thing. Modern discoveries have done little to resolve the question and a great deal to deepen it. In 2018, an investigator working in the basement of the old Crichton premises located a stone that, by its dimensions and material, bore at least some resemblance to the descriptions given by Baudouin and Marshall. Whether this stone is in any sense the stone from the bindery, or merely a stone that happened to be in the building, has not been established. In the same period, a separate stone was identified on Oak Island itself, bearing markings that some observers have interpreted as artificial and others as natural, and which has been tentatively named in the literature of the subject, the Tory Stone. Neither object carries the iconic symbols supplied by Kempton. Neither can be securely linked to the chimney, the window, or the bindery floor. They are candidates, and candidates only, for a role whose script has already been largely lost. What these findings suggest is that the identity of the Oak Island stone was never a fixed fact waiting to be discovered. It was, from the beginning, a moving target. The stone was whatever the person describing it needed it to be at the moment of the describing, and when the describing stopped, the stone quietly became something else. Expanding section 7, now at exactly 1,000 words. On the floor of the Creighton Bindery, through the long working decades of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the stone served its new purpose with the indifference of ordinary matter. It lay flat. It was heavy enough not to shift under use. Leather was placed upon it, and the leather was struck with wooden mallets and metal-headed beaters until the fibers softened, and the material took on the pliability that binding required. Day after day, the hides of calves and sheep and goats, destined to become the covers of ledgers and prayer books and trade catalogs, were pressed and pounded against its surface. Whatever marks the stone had once carried, if it had carried any marks at all, were subjected to an erosion that was neither dramatic nor deliberate, merely continuous. A soft inscription scraped out by a blunt instrument cannot survive that kind of attention for long. A harder inscription might have lasted longer, but the stone in the bindery, by the testimony of those who saw it, carried no inscription at all by the time the century turned. The irony is not subtle, and the story does not require it to be pointed out to be felt. An object that had been promoted as the key to buried millions, translated by a professor, displayed behind glass, quoted in prospectuses, and sold to investors as the physical proof of a fortune waiting beneath an island, had been quietly demoted to the most ordinary function imaginable. It softened leather. It held still while work was done upon it. It asked nothing of anyone, and no one, by this point in its career, asked anything of it. The stone that had been a promise became a tool, and the tool, in time, became a fixture, and the fixture eventually became invisible. The men who used it had forgotten or had never known of what it was supposed to be. The Creighton business did not last forever. Firms of this kind, and tied to the old trades of printing and stationery and leather binding, were among the first casualties of the changing economic order that followed the First World War. The demand for custom-bound volumes declined. Machine-bound books from larger publishing centers displaced the work of smaller regional shops. The waterfront district of Halifax, battered by the Great Explosion of 1917 and reshaped by the commercial reorganizations of the following decade, was no longer the environment in which a small family bindery could be sure of steady work. By 1919, the Creighton business had closed. The premises were given up. The contents of the workshop were dispersed, sold, discarded, or simply abandoned in the way that the contents of failing businesses have always been: dispersed, sold, discarded, or simply abandoned. Somewhere in that dispersal, the stone slipped out of the record. No one wrote down where it went. No one thought to preserve it as a historical artifact, because by that point its historical career had faded so far from public memory that the men closing the bindery may not have known what they were looking at. A heavy flat stone on the floor of a workshop, darkened by decades of use, bearing only the initials of a long-departed workman, was not, on its face, a candidate for careful preservation. It was, on its face, a stone. It weighed what it weighed. It took up the space it took up. When the workshop was emptied, it would have been dealt with in whatever way stones are dealt with when buildings are cleared. The plausible fates form a small and unsatisfying catalog. So the stone may have been taken out into the alley behind the building and simply left there to be buried in time beneath the refuse of later tenants. It may have been broken up and used as construction fill in one of the many small building projects that reshaped the district in the interwar years, becoming part of the foundation of some unremarkable structure whose occupants never knew what lay beneath them. It may have been sold cheaply and without ceremony to a mason or a stoneworker who valued it only for its mass and its workability. It may have been returned to Oak Island by some party whose name has not survived, on the theory that the object belonged there and now lies somewhere on that island, unidentified and indistinguishable from the ordinary geology of the place. It may, most ordinarily of all, have been simply thrown away. What none of these possibilities share with the object's earlier career is any sense of occasion. The stone had been lifted out of the money pit with the ceremony appropriate to a discovery. It had been built into a chimney with deliberate placement. It had been extracted from the chimney by a named man acting on behalf of a syndicate. It had been carried off the island, taken to Halifax, displayed in a window, translated by a professor, quoted in subscription documents. Each of these acts in its time was performed by someone who understood the stone to be significant. The act of its disappearance was performed by no one in particular, for no recorded reason, and left no trace. It was not lost. It was not stolen. It was not even forgotten in the strict sense. It was simply not remembered, which is a different and quieter fate. The asymmetry between the legend and the object by the 1920s had become complete. The legend was thriving. Popular interest in Oak Island had survived the failures of the 19th century syndicates and was beginning to build toward the fresh wave of expeditions and publications that would characterize the middle of the new century. The story was being told, retold, embellished, and prepared for its eventual transmission into the pages of Edward Rowe Snow. The stone, meanwhile, the physical thing on which the legend had supposedly rested, was nowhere. It had been used up. It had done its work. The narrative that had depended on its existence no longer needed it to exist, because the narrative had by now learned to sustain itself without physical anchors. Expanding Section 8 now at exactly 1,200 words. The pattern, once it is laid out in order, admits of only one honest reading. Every moment at which the stone stepped forward into public attention coincided precisely with a moment at which someone required it to. Every expansion of its story corresponded to a fresh need for capital, for credibility, for readership, for renewed interest in an enterprise that had otherwise exhausted its natural supply of all three. The stone did not drive the legend drove the stone, and the stone, a cooperative and silent accomplice, provided whatever face was asked of it. Consider the sequence with the contradictions removed and the motivations placed in their proper positions. The stone emerged into detailed public description in the 1860s at precisely the moment when the Oak Island Association required a fresh subscription campaign. It traveled to Halifax and was placed in a shop window, not by a museum or a learned society, but by a commercial firm, alongside an invitation to buy shares. Its first translation was delivered by a man whose institution operated within the same small civic economy as its promoters, and the translation, conveniently, specified a sum large enough to justify almost any degree of speculative investment. Its most famous cipher, the one that now adorns every popular account of the legend, was supplied in the middle of the 20th century by a clergyman who cited as his source a schoolteacher no longer available to confirm or deny the attribution. Each of these productions arrived at the moment when the legend needed it. None of them arrived at any other moment. The institutions that might, at any point, have intervened to subject the claim to serious examination did not intervene. The university whose professor translated the stone preserved no records of the translation and produced no scholarly follow-up. The Historical Society corresponded about the stone in the 1860s, but did not acquire it, did not request a rubbing, did not commission a drawing. The newspapers reported on it without asking why. No image of its inscription had ever been produced. The successive generations of writers who carried the story forward quoted earlier writers rather than primary sources, and the earlier writers, when traced to their origins, had been quoting promotional material. A chain of credulity, each link of which assumed that the link before it had done the necessary work of verification, stretched across 150 years, and at no point along that chain did anyone stop to discover that the verification had never been performed. This is the mechanism by which legends of this kind are built, and it is useful to name it clearly. The mechanism does not require a conspiracy. It does not require a central author coordinating the production of false evidence across generations. What it requires is something much more ordinary and much more difficult to resist, which is the alignment of incentives. Investors wanted to believe in the treasure because belief was the precondition of the return they hoped to make on their shares. Syndicates wanted investors to believe because belief was the precondition of the capital they required to keep digging. Newspapers wanted readers, and the story of a mysterious cipher stone sold more papers than the story of a failed excavation. Academics in a small colonial city had reputations that were not improved by public skepticism about locally popular enterprises. Writers of popular histories wanted material, and material that combined mystery, treasure, and a convenient symbol was worth more to them than material that dissolved on examination. No one in this chain needed to be dishonest in any crude sense. Each participant could, and probably did, tell themselves that the people before them had done the verification. The investor trusted the syndicate. The syndicate trusted the professor. The professor perhaps trusted the material he had been shown. The newspaperman trusted the syndicate's promotional literature. The later writer trusted the earlier writer. The clergyman trusted his schoolteacher. The schoolteacher is unavailable for comment. At no point in the sequence did anyone stand outside it long enough to ask whether the chain, examined as a whole, was anchored to anything at all. What was being built across these decades and these aligned incentives was not primarily a false claim about a stone. It was a durable narrative infrastructure capable of surviving the loss of the object at its center. The stone itself, as we have seen, disappeared quietly sometime after 1919, and its disappearance did no damage to the legend. The legend absorbed the disappearance without missing a step. By 1949, the absence of the physical stone was, if anything, an advantage. A missing stone could not contradict whatever symbols a writer chose to attribute to it. A missing stone could not be re-examined by a skeptic. A missing stone could and did serve as a perfect screen onto which any desired inscription could be projected. This is the hidden truth the video has been approaching by degrees. The Cipher Stone of Oak Island, in its final and most widely recognized form, was a commercial instrument. It was a device for generating belief, maintained across generations by institutions and individuals whose interests were served by its continued existence as an idea, and whose interests were not served by the awkward work of confirming its details. Whether a real inscribed stone ever came out of the money pit, whether the object in John Smith's chimney bore any marks at all worth describing, whether the stone in the Halifax window was the same stone or a different one, these questions, in the end, matter less than the larger fact. The narrative was never, at its core, dependent on a real object. Okay, it was dependent on the willingness of successive generations to treat the object as real without requiring it to behave as real objects behave. The absence of a photograph, the absence of a rubbing, the absence of a drawing, the absence of scholarly documentation, the absence of agreement about the stone's material, the absence of agreement about its size, the absence of any surviving primary source that can be traced to the moment of the stone's emergence from the pit. All of these absences were not, as they might have seemed, obstacles to the legend. They were quietly and over time the conditions of its survival. A well-documented stone, photographed and measured and cataloged and preserved in a public collection, could have been examined. It could have been found wanting. It could have been reduced to whatever it actually was. The Cipher Stone of Oak Island survived precisely because it was never allowed to become that kind of object. Its power lay in its vagueness, and its vagueness was protected, whether consciously or not, by everyone who had a stake in the protection. Expanding Section 9, now at exactly 1,200 words, the stone, in the end, was never the treasure. The story was the treasure, and the story required only the barest suggestion of a physical anchor to do its work, a rumor of an inscription, a professor's translation delivered without supporting evidence, a clergyman's letter in the middle of the 20th century supplying symbols that no earlier source had recorded. And these were the materials from which the legend drew its strength. And they were sufficient because the people who encountered the legend were not, for the most part, looking for reasons to disbelieve. They were looking for reasons to continue believing, and the stone, in all its conveniently elusive forms, gave them what they needed. What the Cipher Stone reveals when its history is laid out, with the contradictions visible and the motives named, is something larger than itself. It reveals the architecture by which human societies construct and maintain their useful myths. The architecture is not mysterious. It consists of aligned interests, of institutional silences, of the ordinary human preference for stories that promise something over stories that promise nothing. It consists of the slow accumulation of detail across generations. Each detail added by someone who did not quite invent it and who trusted that the detail they were passing on had been verified by someone earlier in the chain. It consists of the willingness, which may be the most universal of human traits, to let a narrative outlive its evidence. The pattern is not unique to Oak Island. Every culture, given enough time, produces objects of this kind. There are disappeared relics in every tradition, lost originals whose authority is invoked, and whose physical details are suspiciously unrecorded. There are translations supplied by the conveniently deceased, inscriptions reconstructed from memory by witnesses whose memories cannot be checked, artifacts that were photographed only after their most distinctive features had faded. The specific shape of each legend varies with its local conditions, but the underlying structure repeats itself with a consistency that suggests it is answering to something in the people who sustain it rather than to something in the objects themselves. What it answers to, as nearly as can be said, is the human reluctance to accept that the world is as ordinary as it generally is. The money pit, stripped of its cipher and its symbols and its translations, is a hole in the ground on a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, dug repeatedly by men who lost money in the digging. This is not, as a story that asks to be told for 200 years. It is a story that ends in its plain form with the failure of the enterprise and the return of the diggers to their ordinary lives. The Cipher Stone, in its various forms, transformed that ending. It promised that the failure was provisional. It promised that the hole was not just a hole, that the island was not just an island, that the digging was not futile, but merely incomplete. It promised, in other words, that the ordinary world contained at this particular location a door that led somewhere extraordinary, and that the door was merely locked rather than imaginary. The promise was powerful enough to draw money from 4 generations of investors. It was powerful enough to survive the physical disappearance of the object on which it supposedly rested. It was powerful enough in the 20th century to generate books and magazine articles and eventually television, each of which added new layers of detail that the earlier record had not contained, and each of which was received by an audience that did not, on the whole, demand that the new details be reconciled with the old ones. The legend grew even as the stone shrank and vanished. The legend grew in part because the stone vanished. What could no longer be examined could no longer be refuted. There is a particular quality to the way such legends end. If they can be said to end at all, they do not collapse in a single moment of exposure. They thin out gradually as the scholarly record accumulates and as careful researchers reconstruct the chains of evidence that the earlier enthusiasts had been content to leave unexamined. A letter is located in an archive. A newspaper article is dated and compared to the promotional context that produced it. A symbol is traced to its first appearance in print, and the first appearance is found to be suspiciously recent. Detail by detail, the legend is dismantled, used not by refutation, but by the simple act of placing its components in their proper chronological and commercial settings. This work is slow, unglamorous, and largely unrewarded. It produces no dramatic confrontation with the believers. It produces instead a quiet body of careful scholarship that anyone can consult, and that most people, understandably, do not. The Cipher Stone has been subjected to this kind of scholarship patiently over the past several decades by researchers whose names are not widely known and whose conclusions do not make for compelling television. Their work has not ended the legend. The legend continues on the island in the literature and the imaginations of the many people for whom the prospect of a buried treasure retains its ancient appeal. What their work has done is to make available, for those who wish to find it, the other story, the quieter story, the story of how the legend was made and why it persisted. That other story, once it is understood, does not diminish the Cipher Stone. It places it more accurately in its proper category, which is not the category of archaeological artifacts, but the category of human productions, the things that people build together across generations because they want them to exist. Somewhere in Halifax in the 1920s, a stone was carried out of a closing bindery and disposed of in a manner that no one thought to record. It may still exist somewhere unrecognized, used as a doorstop in a house whose owners have no idea what they possess, or buried beneath the foundations of a building that has itself since been demolished. It may have been broken up entirely. It may lie on the seabed in the harbor, dumped with the rest of the bindery's unwanted weight. Whatever its final fate, it carried with it on that day whatever residual authority it had ever possessed as a physical thing. It took with it the scratches and initials that Baudouin and Marshall had seen. It took with it the worn surface that had softened so many books. It took with it, perhaps, the last trace of whatever marks had once given the legend its start, worn down by the ordinary labor of ordinary men into a smoothness that held no message at all. What remained once it was gone was the story. The story, as it turned out, did not need the stone. The story had never, in the deepest sense, needed the stone. The stone had only needed to exist long enough to set the story in motion, and the story, once moving, began to carry itself the rest of the way.